There is a story most people already know about this island. It goes like this. A small country borrowed too much from a larger one. The larger one built it a port and a tower and an airport out in the jungle. And when the bills came due and could not be paid, the port was signed away on a lease that runs for 99 years. A debt trap. A cautionary tale. The end. It is a tidy story. Parts of it are even true. There is a port. There is a tower that stands mostly empty. There is an airport where, on some mornings, no passengers arrive at all. But the tidy story explains almost nothing. It does not explain how this island grew rich in the first place. It does not explain what it actually sold to the world. And it does not explain who actually held the debt on the day the money ran short. When you go looking for the single loan that broke the country, you do not find it. You find something older, something stranger, something far more ordinary. Because the largest share of this island's foreign debt, at the moment it could no longer pay, was not owed to any one government. It was owed to the bond market, to thousands of investors scattered across the world who had bought its promises because the rate of return was good. The port that everyone points to was a small slice of what was owed. This is a place that has been selling to the world for 2,000 years. Cinnamon that Europe went to war over. Sapphires pulled from river gravel. Tea that carried its old colonial name onto every shelf on Earth. Shirts stitched for brands hanging in your closet right now. It earned its living, always, from people far away. And then, one spring, it ran out of the one thing it needed to keep the lights on. Not tea, not shirts, dollars. How does an island famous for what it sells end up unable to pay for what it buys? And who was really holding the note when it stopped? To understand the fall, you have to start where the money started. And the money is older than the tea, older than the empire that planted it. Go to the south coast, to the old town of Gaul. Inside a ring of stone walls the Dutch raised in the 17th century, the streets still run the way merchants laid them out. The walls did not go up to guard temples or palaces, they went up to guard a warehouse. This was a trading post first, and a town second. Ships came here for one reason. There was a substance grown on this island that grew nowhere else in the world at anything like its quality. It was worth more, ounce for ounce, than most of what a ship could carry home. And whoever controlled the island controlled the supply. That substance was cinnamon. Not the powder in a kitchen cupboard, the true bark, peeled from a wild tree, dried until it curled, its scent carrying across a harbour before the crates were even opened. For centuries, this was among the most valuable trade goods on the planet. Kings taxed it. Empires fought over the coastline that produced it. The Portuguese came for it. The Dutch pushed the Portuguese out and took the trade for themselves, running it through a company that ranked among the wealthiest enterprises the world had ever seen. They mapped the cinnamon lands. They set quotas. They punished anyone who peeled bark without permission. A single spice from a single island helped underwrite a commercial empire that spanned oceans. And notice who was doing the earning. Not the island. The island grew the bark and dug the stones. The real profit was taken by the company that controlled the ships and the ports and the buyers at the far end. The producer earns once, at the source. The trader earns at every step after. For most of its history, the island was the producer and someone else was the trader. It made the thing the world wanted. It rarely owned the route the thing traveled or the shelf it landed on, or the bank where the money finally came to rest. Keep that in mind, because centuries later, the island would spend a fortune trying to become the trader at last, to own the port and take the cut instead of only making the goods that passed through. Remember this, because it is the oldest lesson the island teaches. Its fortune has always come from selling something rare to buyers on the far side of the world. That is a powerful way to grow wealthy. It is also a fragile one. When the buyers change what they want or find it cheaper somewhere else, the island has very little say in the matter. The gem trade tells the same story in a different mineral. Inland, near the town of Ratnapura, whose name simply means City of Gems, men still stand waist-deep in muddy pits, washing gravel through woven baskets, looking for color. This has been happening for well over 1,000 years. Sapphires from this island have traveled into crown jewels and royal collections across continents. Some of the most famous blue stones on Earth began in a river valley here, in the hands of a man who could not afford to buy back what he had found. And before the cinnamon, before the gems were famous, there were the pearls. In the shallow gulf off the northwest coast, for centuries, divers went down on a single held breath, again and again, to tear oyster beds from the seabed in a season that lasted only weeks. The pearls of this coast were known in the ancient world. They were traded to Rome. They were named in the oldest surviving accounts of the island. Merchants sailed here from Arabia, from India, from farther still, because the island sat squarely on the sea road between the east and the west. Almost everything moving between those two halves of the world passed within reach of its coast. That location was the island's first fortune, older than any crop. It was a crossroads, and a crossroads earns simply by being in the way of everyone else's journey. Cinnamon, sapphires, later, coffee. The island sold and the world bought, and for a long time that arrangement held. But the arrangement rested on someone else deciding the island was worth trading with. And in the 19th century, that someone decided to stop trading with it and start owning it outright. The British took the whole island. Not just the coast this time, but the Highland Kingdom at its heart, the inland court of Kandy, which had held out against every foreign power for 300 years. When Kandy fell, the last independent kingdom on the island was gone. And the new rulers looked at those cool, misted mountains and saw not a kingdom, but a balance sheet. They planted coffee first, across the central hills, and for a while it paid handsomely. Then, in the 1870s, a fungus swept through the estates. The coffee leaves blistered and dropped. Whole plantations died within a few seasons. The fortune that had been built on coffee simply rotted on the branch. But coffee left something behind that outlasted it. To move the beans down from the hills, the British had cut roads through the mountains, and then laid a railway, climbing the slopes on tight curves and stone bridges all the way up to Kandy and beyond. That railway was built for coffee. Coffee died. The railway remained. And when tea replaced coffee on those same hillsides, it rolled down to the coast on tracks a dead crop had paid for. Infrastructure works like that. It is built for one fortune, and it quietly serves the next. Much later, in a different century, the island would build ports and airports on borrowed money, betting on a fortune that had not yet arrived. Sometimes that bet pays, the way the coffee railway paid. Sometimes the next fortune never comes, and the infrastructure just sits there, waiting, with the loan still ticking. Most planters were ruined. Some walked away from land they could no longer sell. And this is the pattern again. A single crop, one disease, and a fortune gone almost overnight. But out of that ruin came the thing this island is still known for. Because a handful of planters, standing in dying coffee fields, decided to try a different plant. In 1867, a young Scot named James Taylor cleared a patch of forest on an estate called Lulekondera in the hills above Kandy. He was not yet 20 when he first came to the island. He taught himself the plant by trial and error. He built his own rolling machine on his veranda. He worked out how long the leaves needed to wither, how hard to roll them, how long to let them turn before firing them dry. The plant was tea, and the hills he was standing in turned out to be almost perfect for it. High enough for cool nights, wet enough for constant growth, steep enough to drain. When Taylor sent his first small consignment to the auction rooms, sold. Then it sold again, for more. Within a generation, the dying coffee estates had been ripped out and replanted, hillside after hillside, with row upon row of tea. One man had shown it could be done. It took another to sell it to the world. His name was Thomas Lipton. He was a Glasgow grocer, the son of a small shopkeeper with a gift for making ordinary people want what he was selling. In the 1890s, he came to the island, bought his own estates outright, and cut out every middleman between the hillside and the shelf. His slogan was plain, and it was brilliant. Direct from the tea garden to the teapot. Before Lipton, tea was expensive, and it was sold loose, weighed out by hand, its origin a mystery to the person drinking it. Lipton packaged it, priced it so a working family could afford it, and stamped the island's colonial name across the label: Ceylon. Suddenly, a factory worker in Britain could drink tea from a specific hillside on a specific island half a world away and know exactly where it came from, because it said so on the tin. By 1891, a single consignment of the island's tea fetched a record price in the London auction rooms. The name Ceylon became, for millions of people who would never go there, simply the place the tea comes from. That reputation was worth more than any one harvest. It was a brand, and a brand can earn for a century. Think about what tea actually is, as a business, because the mechanism matters. Tea is not planted once and harvested once. A tea bush, once established, is plucked every 7 to 10 days, for decades. The top 2 leaves and a bud, taken by hand, again and again, all year round. It is one of the most labor-intensive crops on Earth, and that is precisely why it made money on this island. The land was suitable, the rainfall was reliable, and there was a workforce that could be made to pluck it cheaply for generations. The making of it is its own small industry. A plucked leaf has hours, not days, before it spoils. So every tea district needs its own factory, close enough to receive the day's picking while it is still fresh. Inside, the leaves are spread to wither, then rolled to bruise them, then left to oxidize, turning from green to copper, before they are fired dry and sorted by size through a cascade of mesh screens. A hillside, a factory, an auction, a ship. That chain has run, almost unchanged, for a century and a half. At its height, the industry employed hundreds of thousands of people directly and touched the lives of well over 1 million more. Whole towns exist only because of the leaf. It is no longer the largest earner the island has, but it may be the most deeply woven into it. You cannot pull the tea out of this economy without pulling out a great deal of the country along with it. That workforce did not come freely, and it did not come from the local villages. The people of the surrounding lowlands would not do the work for the wages offered. So the planters brought in labor from across the water, from southern India, under a system of contracts that bound families to the estates. They walked for days to reach the hills, many died on the way. Those who survived were housed in long rows of cramped quarters, the line rooms, and paid by the weight of leaf they picked. Their descendants are still there, generations later, still plucking the same hillsides. They are called the up-country Tamils, or the hill country Tamils, and they built the single most valuable industry the island has ever had. For all of that, they have spent much of the last century on the margins, denied citizenship for decades, left out of the schools and the roads that the tea money paid for elsewhere. The fortune grew on their backs, and very little of it ever settled on their shoulders. This is the part the postcard leaves out. The mist over the tea gardens is genuinely beautiful. The green is almost unreal. But every one of those neat green terraces was carved by hand, and is still worked by hand, by people who have never been paid what the leaf was worth. Hold that, because it explains something about the whole country. The island got very good at earning foreign money. It was never as good at deciding who, at home, would share in it. By the time the island won its independence, in 1948, the shape of its economy was set. It lived by selling a small number of things to the world. Tea, above all. Rubber, tapped from plantations the British had also laid down. Coconut, from the coastal belt. 3 crops, sold abroad, earning the foreign currency that paid for nearly everything the island had to import. Because here is the trap inside the fortune. The island grew tea and rubber and coconut in abundance. It did not grow enough of its own rice. It did not make its own machines, or its own fuel, or its own medicine. All of that had to be bought from abroad. And to buy from abroad, you need foreign money. For a while, the sums worked. During the Second World War, with rubber suddenly a strategic material, prices spiked, and the island earned more from its plantations than it ever had. There was money in the treasury. The new nation used it to build something rare in the region, a broad system of free schooling and free healthcare and subsidized food. Its people lived longer and read more than almost any of their neighbors. On paper, this looked like a country that had figured out how to turn a colonial cash crop into a decent life for ordinary people. But the crops that paid for all of it were sold at prices the island did not set. And through the middle of the 20th century, those prices sagged. Tea and rubber earned less on the world market year after year, while the cost of the rice and fuel and machinery the island had to import kept climbing. The gap between what it earned abroad and what it needed to spend abroad opened up, and it never really closed again. That gap has a name in economics: the balance of payments. And for this island, it would become the central drama of the next 70 years. To see how the fortune actually moved, you have to go to Colombo, to a set of rooms where, 3 days a week, the island's wealth is still auctioned by voice. The Colombo Tea Auction is one of the largest in the world, and it has been running for well over a century. Brokers taste hundreds of samples in advance, slurping and spitting, grading each lot by flavour and colour and leaf. Then the buyers gather, and the lots are called, and prices are shouted and struck in seconds. A hillside's entire season can change hands in the time it takes to clear your throat. From those rooms, the tea moves to the port a few kilometres away, into containers, onto ships, and out to the tea drinkers of the world. And the money moves the other way. Foreign currency flowing back into the island in exchange for leaves. For a long time, that was the whole engine. Sell the crop, earn the currency, buy what you cannot make. But by the 1970s, the engine was stalling. The island had spent 2 decades turning inward, trying to make things at home behind high walls of tariffs and import bans, running most of the big industries through the state. It had not worked. The factories were inefficient. The shelves were bare. People queued for basic goods. The foreign currency was so scarce that even the rice ration was cut. A country that fed the world's teacups could not reliably feed itself. And so, in 1977, the island did something that set it apart from every other economy in the region. It threw the doors open. The man who opened them was the finance minister, Ronnie DeMel. He was, by any measure, a sharp one. He dismantled the walls of import controls. He courted foreign investors. He set up special zones near Colombo, close to the port and the airport, where foreign companies could build factories, bring in their machines duty-free, and pay very little tax for years. It was the first move of its kind in South Asia. Years before its giant neighbours would try anything similar, this small island bet its future on selling to the world again. But this time, not just from the soil, from the factory floor. And the world came. It came for one thing above all: clothing. Foreign brands discovered that this island had exactly what a garment industry needs. A large workforce, much of it literate, much of it women, willing to work for wages far below what the same work cost in richer countries. Within a decade, the export processing zones outside Colombo were stitching shirts and underwear and dresses for labels sold in shopping malls thousands of miles away. Garments passed tea to become the island's single largest export earner. The country that the world knew for a drink became, quietly, one of the places the world's clothes were made. Look closer at who was doing the sewing, because it matters. The garment floors ran, overwhelmingly, on the hands of young women, many from rural villages, many the first in their families to earn a formal wage. They moved to the zones. They lived in boarding rooms. They sent part of every pay packet back to the village. It was hard, repetitive, closely timed work, for wages that would have been unthinkable in the countries where the shirts were sold. That gap in wages was the whole competitive edge. It was also the whole vulnerability. Because a low-wage advantage is a borrowed thing. Someone is always poorer and hungrier and cheaper. As the years passed, the island found itself undercut by newer entrants, by Bangladesh and by Vietnam, where the same work could be done for even less. So the island tried to climb. It moved toward finer garments and sold itself on quality and on clean, ethical factories, rather than on the lowest possible price. It worked, to a point. But it left the country running hard simply to stay in place. Its second great pillar, always one wage cut away from being outbid by somewhere newer. Follow the chain, because the chain is the whole story. A brand in Europe or America designs a shirt. The fabric is bought, often from elsewhere in Asia. The cutting and sewing is sent here, where labour is cheap and the quality is high. The finished shirt sails back out through Colombo, and the foreign currency sails in. Every stitch is a few cents of that currency earned. Millions of shirts, billions of stitches. And out of that came the second great pillar holding up the island's supply of dollars. The first pillar was the old one, the plantations, tea still steady in the highlands. The second was garments, humming in the zones. And through the 1980s and 90s, a third pillar rose, quieter than the others, and in some years, larger than any of them. It rose in the departure hall of the airport. Every day, plane loads of the island's own people left it, bound for work in the building sites and kitchens and households of the Gulf. Men to pour concrete under a desert sun. women in enormous numbers to clean and cook and raise other families' children in cities across the Middle East. They went for years at a time, and every month they sent money home. Those remittances became one of the largest single sources of foreign currency the island had. Not a company's profit, not a crop's harvest. The wages of ordinary people, wired back in small amounts, adding up to billions. A daughter's salary from a household in the Gulf paid for a brother's schooling, a mother's medicine, a new roof on a village house. And in the national accounts, all of it landed as precious foreign exchange, quietly balancing the books that the crops alone could no longer balance. Follow one such worker because the number hides the person inside it. She is a woman from a village in the dry zone. There is little paid work near home. So she signs a 2-year contract, hands a fee to an agent, boards a flight she has saved months for, and lands in a city she has only seen in photographs, to keep house for a family she has never met. She will not see her own children for the length of the contract. She will speak to them by phone, late at night, across the time zones. And on the last day of every month, she will walk to a money transfer counter and send home almost everything she has earned. Multiply her by hundreds of thousands scattered across the Gulf, and you have one of the largest sources of foreign currency the island possesses. The country's ability to pay its import bills rested, in no small part, on that monthly walk to the counter, made by people the economy could not find work for at home. There is a cost buried in that pillar too, and it should be said plainly. Millions of families were held together at a distance by a parent working an ocean away, seen for a few weeks every couple of years. Children grew up on video calls and remittance money. The country's balance of payments was steadied by the loneliness of its own people. That is the quiet arithmetic of a small economy that needs more foreign money than its land can earn. It sends its citizens abroad to earn the rest. And through all of it, running for more than a quarter of a century, was a war. For 26 years, from the early 1980s until 2009, the island was torn by a civil war between the state and a separatist movement in the north and east. It is not the subject of this story, but its economic shadow is. War is expensive in the obvious way, in soldiers and weapons and rebuilding. It is expensive in a quieter way too. Tourists do not come to a country at war. Foreign factories hesitate to build there. Investment that might have flowed in went elsewhere, to calmer places, for a generation. So imagine the ledger through those decades. Tea earning, but earning less than it once did. Garments earning, but competing with cheaper rivals in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Remittances earning, family by family. And against all of it, the steady drain of a long war, and the steady bill for all the things the island still could not make and had to buy. The country kept its head above water, but it was always short of foreign money. And a country that is always short of foreign money eventually learns to do the one thing that will haunt it. It borrows. At first, it borrowed gently. The loans a poor country gets are usually soft ones, from development banks and friendly governments, at low interest, repaid over decades. For a long time, that is what the island took. Cheap money, patient money, the kind you can carry for years without strain. Then, in 2009, the war ended. And for a few short years, it felt as if the island had finally been handed its moment. The guns fell silent. The north opened up. Tourists, who had stayed away for a generation, began to arrive in real numbers, drawn by the beaches and the tea country and the ruins. In the first years after the war, the economy grew at rates it had not seen in living memory, some years above 8%. Roads were laid, hotels rose along the coast. The mood was electric. After 26 years of fear, the country wanted to build, and to build fast, and it wanted the world to see it doing it. But there was a problem hidden inside that ambition, and it goes back to something dull and decisive: where the money would come from. Because the island had, by then, done something that changes everything about how a country borrows. It had grown richer. Not rich, but richer. Enough that the world's lenders reclassified it, lifting it out of the poorest category and into the middle. And when that happens, the soft loans start to dry up. This is the turn that almost nobody outside the world of finance understands, and it is the real hinge of the whole story. A poor country borrows cheaply because lenders accept low returns to help it develop. A middle-income country is expected to borrow like a grown-up, from the markets, at market rates. And so, in 2007, the island did what middle-income countries do. It sold its first international sovereign bond. A sovereign bond is a simple thing wearing a complicated name. The government writes a promise. It says, "Lend us $1 billion today, and we will pay you interest every year, and give you the billion back on a fixed date some years from now." Investors around the world, pension funds, banks, asset managers, buy those promises because the interest is attractive. The money arrives quickly, in a lump, with no lecture attached about how to spend it. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Soft development loans come slowly and with strings. Bond money comes fast and free of conditions. For a government in a hurry to build, bonds are intoxicating. You can raise $1 billion in an afternoon and start pouring concrete next month. But the bond does not care what you build. It does not care whether the thing you build earns anything back. It only cares about two dates: the day it pays interest, and the day, a few years out, when the whole sum comes due at once. And here is the sharpest edge of all. The bond is written in dollars, not in the island's own currency, which the island can print, in dollars, which the island cannot print, and can only earn or borrow. So every bond added a future demand for the one thing the country had spent 70 years struggling to earn enough of: foreign currency. The debt and the shortage were, at heart, the same problem wearing two faces. Now hold everything you have learned, because it is time to go to the place where all of it comes together. Down to the dry, hot south, to a stretch of coast that for most of its history had almost nothing on it at all. To Hambantota. For centuries, Hambantota was a small fishing town on a difficult coast. Poor soil, little rain, not much reason for the world to notice it. And then, in the years after the war, it became the stage for the most ambitious building spree the island had ever attempted. Billions of borrowed dollars poured into this quiet corner. And what they built has become, fairly or not, the image the whole world now carries of the island's fall. They built a port, a deep water harbour, blasted and dredged out of the coast, designed to catch the enormous flow of ships that passes just offshore. Because the logic was not foolish. Some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth run right past this coastline. A third of the world's cargo, and a large share of its oil, passes within sight of it. In theory, a great port here could take a cut of all that traffic, the way the island had always taken a cut of what the world wanted to move. The theory was sound. The execution was the problem. The port was financed largely with loans, much of it from a single foreign lender, at interest rates far higher than the old soft loans. And the ships, for years, did not come in the numbers the plans had promised. A harbour needs more than deep water. It needs the cranes, the customs, the connections, the reasons for a captain to stop here rather than at the older, busier port up the coast at Colombo. Those took time the debt did not allow. The port earned a fraction of what it owed, and the loan payments came due regardless. And there is a deeper irony buried in the geography, because this island already owned one of the finest natural harbours on Earth. Not in the south, in the east at Trincomalee. A vast, deep, sheltered bay that navies have prized for centuries. It needed no dredging, no blasting, no borrowed billions. It was simply there, a gift of the coastline, deep enough for the largest ships afloat. During the Second World War, it was one of the most important harbours in the whole region, and its shore still holds a field of enormous fuel tanks, cut into the hillside, a strategic prize that older powers had fought to hold. The island had a great harbour already. It went into debt to build a lesser one, in a drier place, for reasons that had less to do with the sea than with the map of who was doing the building and where they came from. Geography had handed the island a deep water port for nothing. The island borrowed a fortune for another. A few kilometers inland, they built something even harder to explain. An international airport dropped into the scrub near a wildlife sanctuary. It has 2 long runways, a modern terminal, trained staff, a control tower. It has, by design, capacity for 1 million passengers a year, with room to grow to 6 million. It has almost everything an airport needs. It is missing only one thing: passengers. In its emptiest years, this airport handled as few as 12 travelers a day. Some days, none at all. Airlines placed their bets, then quietly withdrew. The terminal echoed, and the surrounding jungle, which had been cleared to make room, began, in its own way, to take the space back. Wild elephants live in this part of the island, and they move along ancient routes that the airport was built straight across. So the elephants kept walking their routes. They wandered onto the access roads. They crossed the empty parking aprons in the early light. At one point, staff had to be posted and fencing raised, simply to keep elephants off the runway of an international airport that had almost no aircraft to protect. The building had grown so quiet that the animals treated it as forest again. It became known around the world as the emptiest airport on Earth, and it earned that name honestly. Up in Colombo, they raised a tower, the tallest in the region, its top shaped like a lotus flower, lit at night in shifting colors. It was meant to hum with broadcasters and restaurants and crowds. For years it stood mostly hollow, a bright spike over the city, another loan to be serviced from public funds. A conference hall, a second cricket stadium in a district that already struggled to fill the first. Project after project, each financed with borrowed money. Each raised faster than the traffic or the tenants or the demand that was supposed to fill it. And in the capital itself rose the most ambitious bet of all. Off the shore of Colombo, dredgers pumped sand from the seabed and built new land where there had been open water. Hundreds of hectares of it, raised from the ocean, meant to become a gleaming financial district, a rival to the great money hubs of Asia, with towers and marinas and an artificial beach. The land was real. The sand was real. The ambition was to conjure, on that reclaimed ground, an entire new economy of banks and offices and foreign capital. But a financial centre is not made of land. It is made of trust and law and decades of reputation and the quiet confidence of money that it will be safe there. You can dredge the land in a few years. The trust takes far longer, and it cannot be borrowed. So the new ground sat there, mostly empty, waiting for a future to be persuaded to move in, while the cost of raising it from the sea was added to everything else the country owed. This is where the tidy story takes hold, and it is worth being precise about why the tidy story is wrong. Because when the world looked at the empty airport and the underused port and the hollow tower, and saw that much of the money had come from a single foreign government, it reached the obvious conclusion: a trap. A larger power had lent a smaller one enough rope to hang itself, so that when the smaller one could not pay, the larger one could seize the prize. And there was one fact that seemed to prove it. In 2017, unable to make the port pay, the government leased it out to a company owned by that same foreign state for 99 years. It looks, from a distance, like a country handing over its harbour to settle a debt it could not carry. And that is how much of the world remembers it. But go a layer deeper into the actual books, and the story changes shape entirely. Because when you add up everything the island owed to foreign lenders in the years the crisis broke, the loans for that port and those southern projects were a small part of it. The repayments on Hambantota in the years before the lease came to only a few % of the island's total foreign debt service. The single largest category of what the island owed was not loans from any government at all. It was those international sovereign bonds. The promises sold to investors on the open market since 2007, gathering into a wall of dollars that all came due within a few short years of each other. Study after study, by researchers with no reason to flatter anyone, reached the same conclusion. The debt trap story was the first story told, and the first story always sticks. But it was not the true one. The island was not a helpless victim of a single scheming lender. It had, with open eyes, chosen to fund its ambitions from the global bond market because bond money was fast and came without lectures. The bilateral loans made the striking photographs. The bonds made the crisis. It matters that we get this right, and not because any lender is owed a defense. It matters because the wrong story teaches the wrong lesson. If you believe a scheming foreign power reached in and sprang a trap, then the moral is about that power, and about ports, and about lines on a map. But if you look at the books and see that the island borrowed most heavily from the open market, at market rates, to build faster than it could earn, then the moral is quieter and far more useful. It is about the oldest problem this island has ever had: earning less foreign money than it needs, borrowing the difference, in a currency it cannot make, from lenders who can always change their minds. That is not a trap sprung by an enemy. It is a pressure that has sat on this island since long before anyone drew a modern line of who owed what to whom. And the bonds had a schedule. That is the thing about borrowing in lumps that come due on fixed dates. You can see the reckoning coming from years away. Everyone in the finance ministry could see it. Around the turn of the 2020s, several of the largest bonds would mature at once. Billions of dollars owed in full in foreign currency within a narrow window. To pay them, the island would need either to have earned enormous reserves of dollars, or to borrow fresh dollars to cover the old ones, rolling the debt forward the way it always had. So everything now depended on the island still being able to earn, or borrow, enough dollars when that window arrived. Everything depended on the three pillars holding and on the markets staying open. And in the space of about 2 years, both of those things failed at once. The first crack was self-inflicted, and it was about revenue. A government cannot service debt on ambition alone. It services debt on taxes, the money it collects at home, converts, and uses to buy the foreign currency it owes. And at the very moment the bond wall was approaching, the island cut its taxes sharply, deep and wide, in the belief that lower taxes would spark enough growth to more than make up the difference. The growth did not come. What came instead was a hole in the government's income, right before its largest bills fell due. The state was collecting less, precisely when it needed to be saving more. There is a mechanism here that turns a shortfall into a spiral, and it is worth understanding because it is the trap the island could not climb out of. When a country borrows from the bond market, the market watches it. Rating agencies score its promises, the way a lender scores a borrower, and that score sets the price of every future loan. A country in good standing can always borrow fresh dollars to pay off the old ones, rolling the debt forward, buying itself time. But let the score slip, let the market lose its nerve, and the door does not merely narrow, it shuts. No one will lend you new dollars to repay the old ones. And a country that cannot roll its debt forward must pay it out of reserves it does not have. That is what happened. As the revenue hole opened and the reserves thinned, the island's credit score was cut, and then cut again, until the bond market simply closed to it. The one escape it had always relied upon, borrowing new money to cover the old, was gone. The wall of maturing bonds was still coming, and now there was no way over it, and no way around it, and no fresh dollars left to buy a way through. The second crack came from outside, and it fell on all three pillars at the same time. A pandemic swept the world, and a country that lived on tea and shirts and tourists and remittances discovered how exposed each of those pillars really was. The tourists vanished first, overnight, as borders closed. The hotels built in the hopeful years after the war stood empty. The beaches emptied. An entire pillar of foreign currency gone in a season. The garment orders were cancelled or delayed as shops shut across Europe and America. And the workers in the Gulf, the quiet third pillar, were sent home in their thousands as construction froze and households cut back, so that even the remittances thinned. Three pillars and a wall of debt approaching, and within a year and a half, the ground beneath all three had given way together. The reserves began to drain. Every month, more dollars flowed out for the fuel and food and medicine the island had never learned to make for itself, and fewer flowed in from the pillars that had failed. The government spent its foreign currency defending the value of the rupee and buying essentials, and making the bond payments as long as it could. The reserve fell and fell, from billions to a fraction of that, to almost nothing. And a country cannot buy fuel with a currency the world will not take. It can only buy fuel with dollars, and the dollars were running out. What that meant on the ground was not an abstraction on a balance sheet. It was a queue for petrol that stretched for a kilometre and did not move for days. It was a cooking gas cylinder that could not be refilled. It was hospitals rationing medicine because the importers had no dollars to pay their foreign suppliers. It was hours of the day with no electricity because there was no foreign currency to buy the fuel that ran the power stations. A country that had lengthened its people's lives for 70 years suddenly could not keep its own lights on. The shortage of foreign money, that old quiet ache in the balance of payments, had finally become visible in every kitchen and every fuel station on the island. And then came the date. In the middle of April 2022, the government announced that it would stop paying its foreign debt. It could no longer spare the dwindling dollars for bond coupons while its people queued for fuel. A few weeks later, a payment came due, an interest payment of around $78 million, and it was not made. For the first time in the island's history, since independence, since it had ever borrowed from the world at all, it defaulted. The country that had sold cinnamon to empires and tea to the planet and shirts to every mall in the West could not pay the interest on its own promises. It was not a dramatic explosion. That is the thing people misremember. There was no single loan that broke it, no one villain who sprang the trap. There was a small, open economy that had always earned less foreign currency than it needed, that had borrowed the difference in a currency it could not print, from a market that had a schedule and that ran out of road when its three earners failed at once. The default was not a lightning strike. It was the last, quiet click of a machine that had been running toward that point for a very long time. By the time it stopped paying, the island owed sums equal to more than the entire value of everything it produced in a year. And when the accountants finally sorted that debt into piles, the piles told the true story, the one the photographs never did. The largest pile, by a wide margin, was the bonds. The promises sold on the open market, held by investors scattered across the world, none of whom had built a port, or a tower, or an airport in the jungle. They had simply bought a good rate of return from a country that could no longer deliver it. What follows a default is not the end of the story. It is a negotiation. A country that has stopped paying does not vanish. It sits down, through its advisors, with the people it owes, and tries to agree on new terms. Some of the debt is stretched over longer years. Some of the interest is reduced. Some of what was owed is, in the end, simply written off, because a lender would rather recover part of a loan than chase all of a loan that cannot be paid. The island entered that long technical process. It sought an agreement with its bondholders and its lending governments alike, and it turned to the international lender of last resort for support while it did. It is slow work, measured in years, conducted in rooms far from the fuel queues. But it is the ordinary machinery by which a default is, in time, resolved. The island was not the first country to walk that road. It will not be the last. So who was really holding the note? Not one government, not one scheme. Thousands of ordinary investment funds, and the choices of a country that had reached, again and again, for the fastest money it could find, to build a future it hoped would arrive in time to pay for itself. The future arrived late. The bills arrived on schedule. That was the whole of it. It is tempting, standing at the end of this, to reach for a lesson, a warning, a moral to pin on the island like a label. But the island resists it, because its story is older than any single crisis, and stranger than any single blame. Think back to Gaul and the cinnamon, and the walls the Dutch built to guard a spice. Think of the sapphire washers standing in the river gravel, and James Taylor rolling tea leaves on his veranda, and Thomas Lipton stamping an island's name onto a tin so a stranger a world away would know where his drink was born. Think of the garment floors humming outside Colombo, and the daughter in a Gulf kitchen wiring her wages home, and the auctioneer in Colombo calling a hillside's harvest in the space of a breath. Every one of those is the same act, repeated across 2,000 years. An island selling something the world wanted, to buyers it could not see, for money it could not make at home. That was always its fortune, and it was always, in the very same motion, its exposure. To earn your living from people far away is to live at the mercy of what those people decide to want, and how much they will pay, and whether they will keep coming. The cinnamon lost its monopoly. The coffee caught a fungus. The tea faced cheaper rivals. The tourists could be frightened off by a war or a virus. The bond markets could close. The hills still grow tea. The auction rooms in Colombo still fill 3 days a week with the sound of harvests changing hands. Ships still pass the southern coast in their thousands, close enough to see from the empty runways of Hambantota. The elephants still cross the aprons in the early light. And the island still does what it has always done. It sells to the world, and it waits to see what the world will pay. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said about it. Not that it was trapped, and not that it failed, but that it has always lived by the sea lanes and by the reach of distant hands. That is where its wealth has always come from. And it is the one place from which its wealth can always, without warning, be taken away. The queues have eased. The lights have come back on. The tea is still the finest in the world, and the sapphires are still blue. And somewhere out on that coast, a ship is deciding right now whether to stop. If this journey stayed with you, consider subscribing and traveling with us to the next place where the map hides a fortune and a fall. Until then,